Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Kieran Aurora. I'm a partner at Evershed Sutherland, specialising in sustainable energy and infrastructure. And for the last 15 years, I've been providing pro bono support with the wonderful Legal Response Initiative, supporting the UNFCCC negotiations. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Hugh Davis, who's got a fabulously rich experience supporting and training climate negotiators over decades, fresh back from Belém to the Barbican, from 24 degrees to barely 4 degrees. Welcome to London. Thank you for joining me. How was it there?
Well, I mean, it was hot. 24 is underestimating, I think. 35 degrees more to kind of -5 there.
Okay.
But no, I mean, it was a really interesting COP. I mean, the headlines people have seen about floods, about fires, about protests, they were some really relevant points and created a lot of drama. But overall, it wasn't that dramatic the whole time, thankfully. And I think the thing to remember is going into this COP, the expectations and hopes were very mixed.
Yeah.
We'd had a year where the Brazilian presidency had been quite mixed in their own performance. The geopolitics, the economics weren't great for a big outcome from a climate conference. And also, we were coming off the back of a COP last year in Azerbaijan, where the outcome wasn't great for a lot of countries. There was a new finance goal agreed, and it was very balanced towards developed countries and donor countries, and a lot of countries came out of that very, very, very unhappy. So that it changed the expectations. And then what we saw at COP itself was really interesting, because on the action agenda side, on the corporate side, it was as big as I could have hoped for or expected.
Mm-hmm.
All the major players were there, were visible, were active. It felt almost as big as the Dubai COP from that sense, which, based on the sort of the narrative and the stories we'd had throughout the year, was in some ways surprising. But after we saw the biggest New York Climate Action Week ever, maybe wasn't that surprising. So that was great on the kind of corporate and action agenda side. On the civil society side, it felt different. It felt like more civil society groups were there as part of the COP, including the Blue Zone negotiation side. And a huge number of indigenous peoples there, not just at this kind of moment of difficult protest in the first week, but throughout, and having a voice throughout. And all of this, I think, had an impact on the negotiations, which had its usual kind of rhythm and highs and lows and sort of moments at the beginning where everyone was like, oh, we're doing the same thing again. But then actually, I think the negotiators got down to work quicker than usual. And there's a few different reasons for that, which I'm sure we'll dig into later. But I think actually that voice of civil society and that momentum got people's hopes up, maybe more than they should have done.
Right.
Given the kind of geopolitical context. And that's why it felt like it did at the end in some of the details we'll dig into later.
Yeah, well, from the outside looking in, it certainly felt like there'd been a shift in focus. It was a more inclusive COP, and that created more voices, not always with clarity. And we definitely want to dig into that. So we've just got 45 minutes for this session. And for those listening in, you're very welcome to ask questions. We'd love to have your questions. I can't guarantee that we will get to them all. If we don't have time for questions at the end, which is a real risk, we will follow up with you afterwards. So please do fire the questions in, just no guarantees that we'll cover them in the time. Hugh, you've got depth of experience in a variety of different capacities. You're currently with CEMUNE, which is the Centre for Multilateral Negotiations, for those that don't know, which is a wonderful organisation with a decade-long track record of advising and training presidencies, chairs, negotiators, coalitions across various different multilateral processes, always focused on climate and sustainability. That's a non-profit, so donors listen in, but you provide expert guidance to participants and also for commentators. We've benefited from your insights, which has been great, and by extension, our clients have as well. And that's all based on deep research as well as individual expertise. So we're very, very privileged to have you and the CEMUNE support here. As an individual, you've got more hard yards on climate change negotiation than most, and you've kind of been there, seen it all, really. You were deputy lead negotiator for the UK as part of COP26. Senior advisor to the UAE with that landmark COP28 presidency, You've been head of climate diplomacy, working on the UK's campaign for the Paris Agreement, amongst other things, working with the European Commission, and now, as I say, working with CEMUNE. So wonderful depth of experience. We're really privileged and pleased to have you with us. So thank you for giving us a bit of time in your busy diary.
You're very kind. You say hard yards, I say grey hairs. It's both equal.
Well, I can compete with you on the grey hairs, but maybe not the rest of the expertise. And as you say, this COP, there was a lot of expectation going in. There's a lot of speculation about how it'd pan out. And there has been some real tangible things that we need to look at the end. In no particular order, climate finance feels like a big area that, with promises made by the EU, amongst others, about the trebling of the finance package, the implementation initiative. So going into the COP, it was billed as the implementation COP. So that was kind of a well signposted and I think partially delivered angle of it. A lot of press attention went to the mention or otherwise of fossil fuels and the debate about whether we were going to have a roadmap or a plan, or whether we're building on previous negotiations, or whether it was going to get forgotten altogether. And this the global Multilateral that has kind of helped coalesce those that want to participate and do more on phasing out fossil fuels. Deforestation, so Belém there in the heart of the rainforest, that must have felt a very tangible and meaningful part of the discussions. And as you said in those opening remarks, a very inclusive COP where civil society was certainly more visible, sometimes maybe overspilling a bit, but certainly more visible and active. And I'd be interested in your thoughts from someone that was there on the ground as to how much that impacted the way that the discussions were had. You're in the rainforest, indigenous peoples around. At times, the protests are coming into the room. So I think that must have felt like a different COP to you. I say you've been there, seen it all, but I think this one probably had a shift in focus and the feel about it. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, yeah, and I think some of that was expected and some of it wasn't. I mean, there's always a different feel when you're in kind of the northern hemisphere in Glasgow, in Paris, to when you're at the kind of the heartland of where people are really feeling the impacts. And you do feel that in a different way. And you're seeing people day to day in the streets affected by the impacts of climate change. You're talking to farmers who are impacted, and you're seeing that rainforest on the doorstep. So yeah, I think it does feel different. And I think that was the big hope going into it, is that because we all knew, and I'm sure we've mentioned it, the logistical difficulties of having it in a place like Belém were huge.
Yeah.
And the trade-off was taking people somewhere which was kind of at the heart of the discussion, the forefront of what we need to try and change and tackle. I think that feeling did have an impact. And maybe, as I say, linked to the civil society voice and to the hopes. Yeah. And so maybe that's why we saw quite a bit of negative coverage at the weekend, I think, in terms of some of the outcomes.
Yeah, it's certainly been quite a polarizing discussion. I think that maybe is born slightly of the fears and anxiety that people have had coming in. So we've had quite a long run of the COP process broadly delivering what it was set up in Paris was the key staging post, about this consensus-based process where we're all in it together and we just keep the ship going on a path that we can all agree is the correct one. And it did feel that this year in Brazil, that was pushed to its limits as to how far we were going. And I think it's impossible not to see that in the context of what's been happening over the last 12 months and the changes in domestic and international politics. And there are obviously significant changes across the Atlantic in the US, and the US said that they were not going to send federal representatives, which is, I don't think we can avoid that. It's a big statement. I'd be interested to know how much that impacted the way the negotiations had been held. Wide debate about the changing geopolitics of where the power lies. US, China obviously being kind of the most significant, but also Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, the changing power of the EU. Is it a waning force? Is it as well organized as it's been in the past? And again, you've been on the inside of the commission to understand kind of the inner workings of that. And I wonder if you could share your thoughts on how that changing multilateralism and that context of how the power shifts are being played out impacted on the COP30 negotiations.
Yeah, first to deal with the US, it's obviously been a key part of the discussion all year in terms of not just climate multilateralism, but broader multilateralism. And there were initially questions, I think, about sort of would we see the same as we saw in kind of 2017, 2018 under the previous Trump administration. And there, I remember well when they were engaged and they were coming to negotiations still. I remember being in Buenos Aires for G20 negotiations and them being engaged, and they're very good negotiators. So when they're negotiating those positions, it's very tough. So there was a question, is this going to be the approach we see? But then it quickly became clear that that wasn't the approach this year. And there was more of a kind of drawing back. And I think there were two main concerns. One is that the US has played a kind of partially a bridge builder, but also a kind of sometimes pushing some of the emerging economies, Saudi Arabia, along with a certain position. And I remember being in the corridors and in Dubai and back of it, and then seeing that firsthand as senior US negotiators were working closely to make sure that they kind of came along with a particular position. And there were concerns that that's not going to happen. And I think, we'll get to some of the outcomes, but that certainly played out without the US there. And then the other concern I think we saw is because the US administration has been unpredictable, and I don't think that's undiplomatic to say, that we might have seen sort of a spoiling move towards the end of COP, a delegation being sent to just, if it was going in a certain direction with a fossil fuel roadmap or something like that, that a delegation could have been sent to block it. Obviously, we didn't see that, but there was that consideration and that nervousness there, I think, throughout the year, and even kind of running into COP.
Yes, well, I suppose even the very statement of the absence gives power to those that have got similar views. So there's a silent but powerful endorsement of certain views that comes through there. I was interested, I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit more on kind of the way those negotiations actually manifest themselves and work through. So, what we do in private practice is if we're regularly helping our clients negotiate positions on things, and what a lot of people don't realize is just the depth of preparation that goes into that. You've got your half hour in the meeting room, and you've got tens and tens, if not hundreds of hours of preparation that go into that. And it must be the same but amplified for a complex multilateral negotiation like any COP, but particularly this year, there must be a huge amount of prep that goes in before anyone arrives in Belém.
Yeah, that's right. And that is certainly one of the key messages I include when we're training negotiators or in consultancy work advising people, is that you can't just think about the day you arrive at COP. There are months before that, and especially because in a lot of the COP process it's done as a group. If you can imagine in a corporate world, you're actually kind of having a pre-negotiation with 10 companies, and then you're going into a bigger negotiation with a lot more from the supply chain, or that's what it's like. There's your initial position discussion here in the UK. That would be kind of multifaceted across all the departments in the UK government, a cabinet office, right round and decision. Then an EU back in the day discussion, and that's even before we get to kind of discussing with others. So there's a huge amount of work that goes into kind of making sure you get to a point where everyone can agree to the same thing. And that's not even to mention the bilateral engagement and outreach and diplomacy to try and shift others your way ahead of the COP as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the level of effort that goes into setting the agenda. We're going to talk about the outcomes, but setting the agenda is maybe 90%. It's hard to put an exact percentage on it, but it's a lot of the battle as to whether you're going to get anywhere with that. And so, and I know that's where you spend a lot of time with the presidencies and chairs in the past, and be interested for your thoughts on, here we had I think quite a visible tension between, or maybe it was a very coordinated good cop, bad cop routine between Leila and the actual COP chair, where we saw slightly different versions of that roadmap. And it became a little bit unclear as to exactly how much buy-in there was to the agenda that was then going to be negotiated. Is that perception fair, do you think, that those differences were real?
I think partially, yeah. I mean, there's two sides to it. There's the kind of the agenda setting through the formal process, And this, through the UK presidency, the UAE presidency, I worked on, it's always a process and a debate and discussion, partly internally, but then with everyone else. And it's about building expectations. Like, something that we always talk about is making sure everyone arrives at COP with the same expectations of what's possible.
Yeah.
Because if everyone arrives thinking you can deliver this or you can deliver that, but actually they're so far apart, then no one's going to be happy.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work, even back in the post-pandemic days, we had a ministerial here in London, which was just about that. It was just about kind of shaping that expectation. And what we've seen in recent years is kind of a bit of a disparity from countries and what they wanted to talk about. And we've had, you might have heard about them, maybe it's too technical, agenda fights, where there's been days spent on what's the actual agenda going to be for the COP. And that's been where some countries have said, we really want to talk about new finance. And some have said, we want to talk about international trade measures, and others have blocked it. And so it's been a bit of a stumbling block in the process. There, I think the Brazilians actually managed to handle it relatively well in the end. But on the kind of the political difference between Lula, I think some of that was for show. It's useful.
Yes.
But I suspect some of it does represent different kind of interest levels. Lula has to get elected and has different people he needs to speak to. Andre is an experienced diplomat and doesn't have that issue, but he does have a great network and friends across the system who he wants to respect and deliver for.
Yes.
So different constituencies. But I suspect some of that was coordinated in a helpful way.
Yeah, got it. I'd love to do more, but I can't. Or, yes, you understand the pressures that are on me. So
exactly.
Yeah. It's we've all used those kind of negotiating tricks in the past.
And Marina Silva, I think the minister played a role there as well in terms of changing the narrative and giving Brazil a certain voice.
Yes.
When it was harder for the presidential role to do that. And to some extent, we did that with the UK, sometimes by accident, where the Prime Minister Boris Johnson or Goldsmith, they had particular interests. So they were happy speaking on a subject more than maybe the presidency would.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that can be really useful.
Yeah. And it often comes down to personalities as well, doesn't it? That you put the preparation in, but you've got real people in the room, and we could all see, even from afar, that, come the final gavel going down, people were tired. It had been a long, exhausting route. And in that situation, the personal chemistry must have an impact on just your ability to go that extra mile, to get that last comma moved if you need to, and to listen to people with respect. And I thought there were some people that really stood out with credibility. We had the controversy with Colombia not being given the stage at the end. And I thought that really brought to the fore the human aspect of how negotiations run, how you fix problems on the fly.
Yeah.
I don't know, were there any kind of standout individuals for you that really were instrumental in what's happened through this process?
Yeah, it always kind of goes in cycles. I think Panama are particularly influential at the moment in trying to give a voice to the less developed countries. I think Colombia as well. And one thing to note in sort of the final plenary is that a pattern that we've seen over recent years is part of how to manage it and deliver something for 200 countries that they can all sign up to is you do maybe give people a voice. So there were at times in that final day where Colombia did come in on a mitigation work programme and others came in and made statements. And that's not unusual. It happened last year in Baku. India came in after the gavel had gone down on the final finance agreement and made a big statement about how unhappy they were. It happened in Dubai on the global stock take and the fossil fuel outcome there, which many saw as a very positive thing. But the small islands were not happy. It didn't go far enough for them. But they came in after it would have agreed. So everyone gets their voice heard while still being able to kind of move on with that kind of moment of multilateralism where 200 countries can come together around something.
Okay. Well, I mean, in a moment, we're just going to go into some of the actual outcomes that came from it, but just be interested in your final thought then on where we are with the state of multilateralism. There's a lot of speculation about whether we were going to get anything out of COP, whether it was going to work. We have a process that has delivered outcomes. There is going to be a COP next year in Turkey. It sounds from what you've just said there that you think the little controversies are not radically different to what's gone before. This is part of normal process and being heard to an extent, and everyone wanting more than you can have, and that's just the natural give and take. Is that a fair take? Is this kind of business as usual for multilateral negotiations?
I think so, but that might be me because I wasn't involved in final negotiations on the final day in the way that I have done in previous COPs.
Yeah.
It's maybe been easier for me to digest this year. If I speak to some of my friends and colleagues who work for the small islands or who work in the EU, they're probably still digesting from an emotional place as well as the kind of did we tick off our boxes. If I see different posts on LinkedIn, there's some quite extreme views, and we had the same last year in Baku. But so for me, the overall point is that one about expectations going into it, and I think we need to remind ourselves of the situation we've got this year.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually, a year with incremental progress across adaptation, across a just transition, some finance indications is actually not too bad. And the door is still open for some progress on the fossil fuel discussion, on the land use discussion. So, but that might be rose tinted. But I think it's better than we should have hoped for, even if it's not better than what we need.
That's probably quite a wise use of the conditional there. Okay, well let's go into some of the tangible outcomes, because there were things that were delivered, some very material bits, in particular on the finance side of things. What's from your perspective, what were the key outcomes that our listeners should be aware of, and in particular those that you think are going to have a big impact?
So I think on the negotiation side, first of all, I think the headline is that we saw some decent progress on terms of adaptation, so supporting countries and regions to adapt to the impacts of climate change that are already here. And as I said, we've seen some progress on this discussion around just transition and sort of what does it mean for the employees, the workforce, the people whose jobs are going to change because of these changes in the economic transition and because of climate change. What was weaker was more on the mitigation and as we said, the fossil fuel side. And there is a door open, that there's this commitment from Brazil to do some sort of roadmap on that and on deforestation ahead of the next COP. It's a real question mark and unknown as to what that looks like. And there's also a couple of new, so a lot of what happens under the UNFCCC and the UN is there's another process or there's another mechanism, and that it sounds boring, but it's how it works. It's how the conversation continues, and you can get the incremental change and the new decisions. And what in the multilateral decision exists is a couple of new things on the mitigation side, on a global implementation accelerator, and so something focused on keeping 1.5 in reach. And so there is a way to keep that momentum up or accelerate that momentum through the system. And then I think I mentioned on the adaptation side, so there's this commitment to now triple adaptation finance, and it's not the timeline that developing countries wanted. It's 2035 instead of 2030, but it is still a big shift. And if you get that public sector finance flowing in that way, that could be a huge difference. I remember ahead of Glasgow, we wanted to agree a doubling of adaptation finance. And I remember I was pushing this with the US and other developed countries, and they were like, no way we could ever agree that. That was only a few years ago.
Yeah.
And now we've agreed a tripling. So it is quite seismic, potentially. Yeah. And that coupled with this agreement on adaptation indicators. So these over 50 indicators have been agreed to kind of measure how adaptation is being dealt with successfully. And the hope is that this could really change the landscape in terms of how that infrastructure is investable. It's not just about kind of, can we invest in these mitigation measures, but can we also invest in helping these countries to adapt? So those are some of the big negotiations outcomes. On the action agenda side, we actually saw a huge amount, like tens and tens of billions committed. The headline was on the Forest Initiative, the TFFF, that Brazil pushed. I think it's around 6 billion put into that. But also in terms of energy and industry, I think there's a pledge to quadruple sustainable fuels by 2035, potentially very significant, especially if that's something that's taken on next year by Australia, Turkey, who I think will have an interest in that as well. In agriculture and food systems, there's nearly 3 billion pledged to support smallholder farmers, for 20 billion in water investment. So there was a lot going on, even if it didn't quite create the sort of the big headlines we saw in Dubai.
Yeah, no, you're right. There was the variety there. A lot of the headlines have been on the energy side of things, and as a sustainable energy lawyer, I kind of naturally gravitate towards that. But the emphasis on nature, I think, is very significant. That is often overlooked, and sometimes there's that kind of tension between kind of the nature-based solutions and the energy needs, and that often is a point of contention in the negotiations. And some aspects that we might reasonably have anticipated being more challenging actually went through quite quickly. So the trebling of the public finance, actually that seemed to go quite smoothly and to be accepted pretty early in the negotiations, whereas you might have thought the EU would fight harder over that.
I think that's fair, but I think it was necessary. So what we saw last year in Baku, and part of the reason why there wasn't sort of anything agreed or anything significant agreed on the mitigation side there, was the alliance between the progressive developed countries and the small ones kind of fell apart a bit, because the offer that the developed countries could make on public finance because of their own situations was not as big as those developed countries. And so it's kind of a response to that. I think, like the UK, they knew that they needed to keep that alliance together if they were to have any hope of something on mitigation coming out in the Multilateral agreement. But it's the timeline, I think, which will continue to fracture, because a trebling by 2035 is very different from 2030.
It is. But it's a great insight that you can't just look at COP30 in isolation. This is part of a year-on-year process of evolving relationships as well as commitments between groups of nations and interested parties. So putting that in context, I think, is very meaningful. And I think we need to look at this kind of coalition of the willing, the mutual, this process, because depending on whether you feel an optimist or a pessimist, you could see that as a really disappointing failure to get a universal view of the roadmap, in particular on fossil fuels. But a more optimistic observer might say, well, this is good. We've got 80 odd countries making positive statements about how we're going to tackle the number one cause of climate change. That could be seen as quite a positive, progressive move. Is it as simple as kind of the disposition of the viewer, or do you think this is a more significant shift in the way discussions are going to be happening going forward?
I think it will always be subjective. I mean, it's very hard to put a quantitative analysis on it. I mean, for me, because we're the Centre for Multilateral Negotiations, we look at it in that broader term, and it has not been a great year for multilateralism. I mean, we saw some positivity on the biodiversity negotiations in Rome, where there were some new financing agreements, which were quite innovative, and that was early on in sort of February. But then we saw the collapse of the plastics negotiations in Geneva in August. We saw the IMO maritime negotiations linked to reducing emissions also being blocked in quite controversial circumstances. So against that picture of it not being a great year for multilateralism, not huge incremental change in the G7 or the G20, actually it was quite significant. I think there were tick boxes across all those areas I mentioned. There was, to some extent, something for everyone, which is all... It's what we always say when we're working on COP presidencies, isn't it? You've got to send everyone home with something.
Yes, yeah.
I think the Brazilians, once everyone's digested it, or they've got their kind of 3 or 4 day flights back to the Pacific, and they get the chance to digest it, I think they'll realise that this is probably maybe not the best we could have hoped for in the current geopolitical circumstances, but it's not too far off. And it's a reflection of the world we're living in this year.
Well, that's quite a profound point, is that there are very different interests right now in the world, and failing to engage in those is going to guarantee failure overall. So we do have to find a way that there's enough there for people to participate in it. But those views are really quite contrasting, you know. So you talk about the damage done to the plastics negotiations, and it's hard, I think. Again, as an energy lawyer, maybe I'm skewed in my focus, but it's hard not to see that as just a function of the extractives and the oil and gas in particular, but to a lesser extent, coal interests. And do you think this is a reaction to the decline of oil and gas as an energy producing tool. You've seen a huge increase in renewables globally. Obviously, that's going to work better for some states than for other, with China being particularly prominent in the manufacture of solar, battery, and other key elements of that energy transition. So do you think the success that we're seeing on renewable energy is almost necessitating a pushback from the petrostates on plastics and other aspects of their revenue streams?
I mean, I think that's part of the picture. I mean, my take on it is it's probably the politics as well, and it's not sort of one reason. It's what's happening in the US. It's what's happening to Russia and their interest there, and therefore there is a greater alignment between Russia, US, and Saudi in terms of economic interests and what they're willing to push in different fora than there maybe was a few years ago. So I think that's part of it, rather than a reaction to the tipping points we're seeing around the technology.
Okay.
And then you've got China, obviously, who are way out ahead in terms of the actual transition, even if they're not willing to kind of commit to that on paper.
Yes. Although we are just starting to see inklings that might be coming now from China.
Yeah.
And that really could be a game changer. I mean, they've got a long history of never over-promising, keeping the cards very close to the chest. But you do just start to see these inklings that there might be a more prominent role and some more significant promises made.
And we saw this at COP. Sorry, there was some more language around sort of with NDCs, not just committing, but attempting to overachieve. And that's not something that's been there before.
Yeah. And I'd like to think a little bit about the journey from where we are now and what's going to come up next. And you mentioned in brief the huge volume of global indicators that come through. That to me feels, if this was the implementation COP, that really seems that's the heart of what's been achieved, is actually giving people the tools now to look at what they're doing, to assess how precisely they are delivering on promises. And for those that sit outside of central government, it gives you a route to participate and to measure how well you're participating. So I think that could be a very powerful part, if not the kind of the heart of what's been delivered here. Do you think that's a fair?
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, before this COP, there was much talk of sort of how we're going to respond to the NDCs, what's going to be the conversation on fossil fuels. But for me, as someone who worked in negotiations for years and seen this kind of discussion around adaptation being kind of downplayed because it's so complex. But I know friends and colleagues who are impacted by this and really need to find a way of getting the investment to flow to make sure that they can deal with these changes. It was one of the key parts for me of this COP. So to see an outcome on that, I was really pleased. And I'm not an investment finance professional, and many of you on the line will be. But I really hope that going away, you will be able to look at those indicators, and that will be able to change different investment strategies, different risk management strategies. And overall, for a headline novice like me, it means that kind of corporate and investment strategies will be a greater percentage focused on adaptation and infrastructure than they are on sort of emission reduction transition structures.
Yeah, it might be helpful for our audience if we give a couple of examples of just what that is in practice. As you say, private sector's got a long, good track record of building plans to situations that are identified, and it's typically uncertainty or unpredictability of the direction of travel that causes the big headaches and slows down the private sector reaction. But where there's a direction of travel that's signposted, private sector's done a fabulous job of adapting, because they can see how it meets their needs or their interests to adapt to a changing regulatory environment. So maybe, I don't know, you could give us a couple of examples of what we're talking about with the adaptation, the need to deal with flood risk and the such like. So how does that become more tangible for corporates and civil society?
Yeah, so what a negative way to look at it is that it's quite a long list. I think it's 59.
Yep.
But the way I see it is it's a menu of something for everyone that allows you to kind of align the rationale for your investments and your strategies with something that's happening at the multilateral level that everyone's signed up to. And then like examples of that menu are sort of local risk assessments, as you say, flooding, resilience spending, community protection, and obviously nature-based solutions as well. So there's something in there for everyone, hopefully, but I would really encourage all those who are interested in that to delve into those decisions, have a look at the detail, and seek greater advice to align those with your strategies where you need to.
Yeah. So what they've done, they've given people the toolbox to understand and to talk about the relevance of their activities and the environmental factors that are going to be risks for them. So it's going to be, with this toolbox, increasingly difficult to say, well, I just didn't realize that's part of my problem.
Exactly.
And if you're sitting on the board of a corporate saying, I don't think it's my problem, or I don't know what the plan is, it's going to be an increasingly uncomfortable position to be in.
Yes.
And they're not, from my read on it, they're not prescriptive. They're not telling anyone the actions that they've got to take. They're just saying, these are the things that you need to be aware of. These are common issues that we're all facing. And as responsible custodians, it's now your choice as to how you engage with that and what you do about that.
Exactly. And I think coupled with sort of national adaptation plans, which are becoming sort of more prominent, and most countries have now submitted them, and they're evolving as NDCs, the emissions mitigation commitments have evolved. But like you say, there will be points where in boardrooms and why didn't we look at this document? I mean, I don't think you would operate in many corporate spaces here without being aware of the UK's NDC or long-term strategy or those type of documents. And I think in many countries that's going to become the same, not just for NDCs, but the national adaptation plans, which will reflect these new indicators that have been agreed.
And so for people now working out what they do, what the significance of COP30 is for them, they've now got some new things to think about. They've got some new tools for those that want to be proactive. They've got some new tools that they can use to have some quite sophisticated discussions. And hopefully, if it pans out as the way people are expecting, it will allow positive peer-to-peer discussions where you can say, well, as a extractive, as a professional advisor, as someone in this space, what are we all doing? Am I assessing the right issues? Where am I relative to my peers? And that kind of positive, friendly competition, I think, can drive a lot of healthy change.
I think that's right. And the one area I touched on earlier, but I think is really worth you looking into in depth from a corporate perspective, is this new just transition mechanism. This is something that it started a long time ago in terms of it came out of unions and workers' rights, but then it was kind of adopted by countries like Saudi Arabia and countries which are really kind of going to have to go through a major transition. And this has always been a big fight between the EU and Saudi Arabia. We don't need this, we do need this. And actually something more substantive was agreed at this COP. So it's worth a look at that to see how you think it might change the narrative for the unions you work with, for the workers' rights in your sector. Because from a multilateral top-level perspective, this should filter down in some ways to affecting conversation or unions saying, have you thought about this new policy in the perspective of this decision at COP30?
Yeah, okay, fantastic. So a lot there for us to unpack. So then looking ahead, so we kept the show on the road. There is going to be a COP31, or at least there's planned to be one. What happens next? So next year we're in Turkey. I wonder if you could help explain to our audience, there's a more complicated setup for next year than in previous COPs. Can you maybe tell us a bit about what we've agreed for the setup for next year and what that might mean for how negotiations unfold?
Yeah, so for those who haven't seen it, there was a big kind of fight discussion between Turkey and Australia for who was going to host COP. And the history to this is that Turkey felt like in Paris, one of the trade-offs they made for making the Paris Agreement and agreeing to it was that they were going to be able to host the next COP. But then the UK came along and we spoiled that and we did a deal with them so that they didn't. And we also did a deal with Italy so that we did so in partnership with them. So it's not unprecedented that countries will work together to deliver a COP. But what has been agreed is quite unique. So the agreement, for those who haven't seen it, is that Turkey will host it. They will be the official kind of president in UN terms. They will have the action. They will own the action agenda. So a lot of the corporate agenda will be owned by Turkey, and they will also appoint the high-level champion, who is this UN role, who kind of has this link between the UN structures, but also business, industry, civil society, and that's become an increasingly important role at COPs over the last few years. Australia will be given a new role called the President of Negotiations, and they will own the negotiations agenda. They will run all of the engagement on that through the year. They will also nominate the Youth Champion. This is a new role, the President's Youth Champion that came in a couple of years ago. And they will share with Turkey a group of new champions on the action agenda with specific sectoral interests. So some of those will be from Turkey, some will be from Australia, and some will be from the Pacific, because the original proposal was for Australia and the Pacific to host COP. And so that still exists. And the pre-COP, which is a kind of informal meeting ahead of the COP, will be held on one of the Pacific Islands. So the Pacific Islands get that. They get to work on the agenda in preparation for that with Australia. And they get as well some of these sectoral champions as well. So it's very complex. But as I say, it's not unheard of. For us as the UK, Italy held the pre-COP. We ran the agenda, but they hosted it. That was a similar arrangement for Chile and Costa Rica, for Egypt and DRC. And there was also an arrangement before when Fiji couldn't host their own COP because of different financial and weather events. So they actually then held the COP in Germany and the pre-COP in their own country. So there's all these different ways of doing it. But this one is particularly without precedent because Australia will be owning and running the negotiations on behalf of Turkey, which spreads the risk in quite a unique way.
Well, quite. And I can get my head around the geographic merry-go-round and people moving from one spot to another. And maybe that's not ideal for messaging on carbon footprint, but logistics, I think you can get your head around. But splitting out that responsibility for setting the agenda and driving the negotiations, fraught with risk, in my view. And that I would anticipate someone that's spent a career prepping and training people for a successful negotiation outcome, you must see that as a huge risk and something that's going to need a lot of preparation to get right.
It does. And I mean, the things to tick off are relatively simple. And we did a lot of this with Italy. It's a written agreement, which they've got. It's governance. And then it's a kind of softer area of kind of goodwill and respect. And with Italy, we had that. And I think with others like Chile and Costa Rica, it was definitely there as well. Here, where it's two very, very different countries, that's the bit I think where everyone's sort of wait and see. And I hope, I mean, knowing some of the people personally from both of those countries, I think and hope that they will work together very closely. But whether to help them have those conversations, they will need others, I don't know, from the UN, from organisations like ours to help facilitate those conversations, and we'll see. But I think that what they need to tick off is relatively simple in theory, but the reality will come as often is down to the politics and the personalities.
Famous last words. Relatively simple, so it's you. You can write that down now. It's been wonderful hearing your insights. We are up against time, unfortunately, so we're not going to be able to go into that in more detail. I would love separately to unpack how you bring together that multilateral prep and the different participants that are going to have to be involved, because having a couple of like-minded individuals isn't sufficient. You do need those communities around to set the ground, to allow the discussions to happen. And once people have had those couple of hours, couple of days of sleep, I think that work's going to start pretty soon. And people will need to draw on their friends and experts. I'm sure CEMUNE will be actively involved in that. They say your phone's going to be ringing constantly if it's not already as part of that. But in all seriousness, for those people listening, if you want to mine Hugh or CEMUNE for more expertise, the details are all available through the website. And if you shoot a message in via the chat, the Q&A, we can link you up, because there is a very serious amount of expertise there, and that work is going to start fairly soon in the prep to Turkey next year. But perhaps even more pressing and relevant to you listening in terms of what you do now coming out of COP30 and how we turn some of those aspirations and toolkits that have been developed into things that have meaning and actually can be used on a day-to-day basis. As I said at the start, we might not have time for questions at the end. We have got to the end of the session, and I'm afraid we didn't have time for those questions. So I can see some have come in. We will try and deal with those by way of follow-up. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you for your attention. Hugh, thank you so much for coming in and sharing those insights with us. It's been a real privilege listening to you, and I look forward to working with you and CEMUNE going forward.
No, thank you very much. I mean, one of the huge pleasures of my job is the impact of sort of training negotiators, young negotiators, Indigenous peoples, and experienced presidents. But I also love working with partners like you. And if anyone on the line is interested in becoming a partner of CEMUNE, whether that's in terms of funding or in terms of briefings from us or working on projects together, please do reach out. We're a small NGO, but hopefully we have a lot of impact. So looking for all partners at all times.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you once again.